Okay, so this morning I'd like us to start by spending a short amount of time looking at today's passage, Genesis 11, verses 10 to 26. And then I want us to quickly recap chapters 1 to 11 of Genesis to remind us about some of the key points of the series so far. Now, the reason that we're doing it that way is because, the reason we're doing it like that is because we've reached the end of a section, the end of one of the main sections of Genesis, and we're going to take a little short break before we return to Genesis in the middle of March. So about a month before we come back to Genesis, and then we're going to be looking at the next section, which takes us from chapter 12 through to 25. So let's get started, beginning with those verses that Patricia read for us. Now, we have encountered a few lists like this already in the book of Genesis. So hopefully you're getting a little bit more comfortable with them, and you're starting to see how important even a list of names can be. Now, the purpose of this passage, the purpose of today's passage is to provide us with a connecting link between Noah's son Shem and Abram, who became, later God changed his name to Abraham. Now, Abram, through whom God carried forward his covenant promises which centered on rescuing a people of his very own, a people who would be God's people. Now, the family tree that we looked at back in Genesis chapter 5 has a very similar form, except this one today, here in chapter 11, the total age of each person is not included. But more importantly, neither is that phrase, and he died. Back in chapter 5, we heard that over and over again at the end of every line, and he died, and he died, and he died. Because the purpose is different. Back in Genesis 5, the purpose was to show that death had entered the human race because of Adam and Eve's sin. But today's passage here in Genesis 11 highlights a move away from death and towards God's promise. And even though the lifespan of the successive generations, even though their lifespan is steadily shortening, nonetheless there is an emphasis here on life. As children are born, and then as they have children of their own. Now it's a list which starts with Shem, who was blessed by Noah. You'll remember that from chapter 9, and ends with Abram, who would receive God's blessing, a blessing which would ultimately extend to the whole world. In a way, Genesis is a book about God's blessing. Now that's probably about as much as we need to say about today's passage. Basically, it continues the line of God's blessing, which previously we've traced through Adam, then Seth, then Enosh, then Noah, and now through Shem, all the way to Abram. And each one of those names that I've just listed, each one demonstrating their faith in the Lord. So now we're ready to meet Abram. But that's going to have to wait until we return to Genesis in a few weeks' time. Okay, so that takes us then to the second part of today's sermon, which is the recap of Genesis chapters 1 to 11, the portion of Genesis that we've been working our way through so far. Now, there's lots of ways that we could summarize these chapters, lots of different approaches that we could take, but I've chosen to use one which I'm hoping will be familiar to some of you. Because back in 2014, if you're around, you're part of the congregation back then, you'll remember that we undertook the E100 Bible Reading Challenge. And we used it, many of us used it in our own devotions over a number of months, but we certainly used it on Sundays to work our way through, basically to try and establish a kind of an overview of the entire Bible. And that was back in 2014. Now, the first section of E100 is called In the Beginning. That's fairly predictable in that way. So it's called In the Beginning, and it looks at these chapters of Genesis, chapters 1 to 11, the chapters that we've been looking at in recent months. Chapters which look at creation, the fall, the flood, chapters that look at God's covenant with Noah, and then most recently look at all of the episode of the Tower of Babel as well. So this morning I'd like us to use the structure that we saw when we did the E100 challenge. This morning I'd like us to use that approach as we look briefly at these events again. And we're going to do that under 3 headings. And I'm hoping that as we do that, the big picture which emerges is that God created a world which was perfect, a world in which our first parents, Adam and Eve, enjoyed close friendship and harmony with God. But that as a result of their sinful disobedience, all of creation, ever since that time, has been damaged. However, right from the beginning, God had a plan to rescue us. So that's what we're going to begin thinking about now. Now, I mentioned that there are 3 headings. The first one is a good world. And here we're looking at chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. So God, who has always existed, created the entire universe. He created it perfect, out of nothing, just by speaking. God made humanity then in his own image, which basically means that we share certain qualities with him, especially the fact that we are spiritual creatures, unlike the animals. God made us to live in perfect harmony with him, with each other, and with all of creation. He made us to live under his loving rule and authority, and to be his representatives on this earth, ruling over the rest of creation, but ruling over creation with him as our king. Now, the opening line of Genesis introduces us to the Bible's main character. What does Genesis 1 verse 1 say? It says, "In the beginning, God." And really, effectively, the rest of Scripture is essentially all about him, about what God is like, and about what it means to live in relationship with him. So chapters 1 and 2 were all about a good world. Then our second heading is a broken world. And here we're looking at chapter 3. Now you'll remember this is the chapter which tells us about Adam and Eve eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the one tree in the garden that God had told them not to eat from. And by questioning this one rule that God had given them, and by disobeying God, Adam and Eve were putting themselves in charge and effectively attempting to push God off his throne. It was blatant rebellion against God and a rejection of God's loving rule and authority. Adam and Eve's desire for independence from God and their act of rebellion, it leads to humanity being separated from God, which results in death, both physically and spiritually. Their sin also damages creation, all of creation, and brings immediate consequences. For Eve, it meant pain in childbirth and a strain in her relationship with her husband. For Adam, sin meant pain in his work and frustration and weariness in all of life. But worst of all, Adam and Eve's sin created a massive dilemma, the most colossal problem in all of human history. The problem is, how can sinful, fallen men and women ever again enjoy fellowship with a holy and perfect God? That's a massive problem. Now, sadly, Genesis 3 ends with Adam and Eve being banished from God's presence, God's loving presence, and thrown out of the garden with no return. Pain, sorrow, and guilt, difficulties in our relationships with others, and worst of all, separation from God. What a horrible predicament. What a horrible predicament sin has landed us in. But the good news is that God had a plan to solve all of these problems caused by sin. And that takes us to our third heading this morning, which is hints of hope. Hints of hope. Now, we've seen the effects of the fall, the devastating and widespread damage which was caused by Adam and Eve's sin. But immediately there are glimpses of hope. First of all, in the promise that God makes to Adam and Eve. It's a promise that's actually contained within a curse. So the first glimpse or the first hint of hope is the promise of ultimate victory over evil. And here we're looking at Genesis 3, verse 15. God curses the serpent, which is Satan or the devil. And God promises that he will put enmity, he will put warfare between Satan and the woman. He says to the serpent, he curses the serpent, and he says to the serpent that the woman's offspring will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Now this is an absolutely astonishing promise. It's one that every believer should know of by heart. The serpent had deceived the woman by his cunning. But that does not mean, not for one moment does that mean that the serpent has possession of Eve. No, there was to be enmity, there was to be warfare between Satan and the woman's offspring. Warfare which would continue throughout all generations. Now you're probably thinking that's not much of a promise. Where's the hope? Where's the good news in the promise of war? But it is good news whenever we realize that it speaks of a day when it speaks of a day when Satan will be crushed. And whenever we realize that the woman's offspring who will destroy Satan is none other than Jesus himself. But this victory comes at a cost, because we're told that the serpent will strike his heel, which of course is a reference to Jesus suffering and dying on the cross. So here in Genesis 3 is the first signpost that we have to Jesus. And so for Adam and Eve, there is hope, even though at this stage the details are vague. And throughout the rest of the Old Testament, a fuller picture develops until ultimately Christ comes. He comes in fulfillment of this promise, and he dies for our sin, granting forgiveness to those who accept his authority and who willingly live under his rule. He restores that relationship with God which sin had destroyed. And that is good news. Now the second glimpse, or the second hint of hope, is seen when God rescues Noah from this worldwide flood, which he sends as judgment on humanity's wickedness. Here we see the grace of God which leads to salvation. And we're looking at chapters 6 through to 8. So this true story about Noah shows us how he and his family, how they're saved through God's gracious plan. The nature of sin is that it always gets worse. It grows like a cancer. And if it's left unchecked, it will destroy us. So you can understand why God hates sin so much. It causes God immense sadness and grief as he watches the pain that sin produces in our lives. Ever since the fall, sin has been spreading. And by the time of Noah, wickedness and violence are everywhere. But Noah was different. He wanted to listen to God, and he wanted to live under God's loving rule. Noah wasn't perfect. We know that from Scripture. He wasn't perfect, but his desire, his heart's desire, was to please God. And so when God told Noah to build the huge boat, the boat that we normally call the ark, when God told him to do that, Noah obeyed. And when the flood came, just as God had promised, it made a clean sweep of all the evil and wickedness that had engulfed the earth. The flood, is a lasting reminder of God's wrath, which will ultimately be faced by everyone who rejects God's rescue, everyone who rejects God's plan of salvation. A plan which at this point involved God graciously sparing Noah and his family from the floodwaters. God could have completely destroyed everyone, and he would have been completely reasonable. He would have been entirely justified if he had done that. But by rescuing Noah, we get another hint that God has a plan for the salvation of this world. Among those rain clouds and floodwaters, Noah's family are clear proof that God has not forsaken this world. No, he loves us, and he has a plan to rescue a people for himself. When the floodwaters recede and Noah's family leave the ark, they were free once again. But were they? Yes, Noah and his family, they were free from the smelly ark, but were they actually free from the stench of sin? Well, sadly, the answer is no. For the time being, those 8 survivors are safe again on dry land. And yes, the first thing they do is to worship God with sacrifices. It seems that Noah understands that their sin problem remains. And his sacrifices hint at a theme which runs right through the Bible. Namely sacrifice. Sacrifice as a way of seeking God's forgiveness for sin. And we see that throughout the Old Testament, and whenever we get into the New Testament, we discover that the key to understanding Jesus' death, the key to understanding that is as a sacrifice for our sin. But for Noah, even at that time, God had a promise. Even though God knows that people are hopeless sinners, he promises never again to destroy the earth using a flood. In fact, God goes to great lengths to assure us, to assure Noah and everyone since Noah. He creates the rainbow as a sign of his everlasting promise. And from that day until now, the rainbow has been a sign of hope, a symbol of God's ongoing love and commitment to his people and to all of his creation. And since the days of Noah, God has given us many other signs too, until ultimately God comes himself. He comes himself to show us his love in person. I'm talking about Jesus, of course, but that will be a few thousand years in the Bible's timeline before we reach that part of God's plan, before we reach the climax of God's plan. Now, before we finish today, we've just one more event that we need to think about. Another hint or another glimpse of hope, and it's the Tower of Babel episode that we looked at last Sunday. Now, people often ask what was so bad about building a tower. After all, surely that was progress. Surely jobs were being created. But the Bible tells us that people were trying to make a name for themselves. And in other words, their motivation was glory for self, not God. Basically, it was arrogance and pride. Ever since the fall, people had increasingly chosen to go their own way instead of God's. And the Tower of Babel was essentially another way in which humanity told God to get lost. Get lost because we're in charge, not you. They were saying we want to live our lives without God. But God didn't allow their pride to continue. No, he confused their language and scattered them. So at one level, this sad incident is yet another example, is yet further evidence of human pride. but it also demonstrates God's ultimate control over everyone and over everything. God is in control and has authority over all of humanity. And in this fact, there are hints of God's grace. Because he uses his power to turn people away from our own rebellious ways and turn us back to him. So in just 11 chapters, the world had become an absolute mess, all because of sin. But despite humanity's sin in the Garden of Eden, despite their sinfulness at the time of the flood, and despite their rebellion at the Tower of Babel, God was at work. God was working to bring about restoration. He was carrying forward a plan to rescue a people for himself. So in all that we have seen in this series so far, in creation, the fall, the flood, the Tower of Babel, in all that we've seen, God assures us of his power to create and to control all things. And we've seen his enormous love for us. Love which set in motion his rescue plan. Love which graciously calls us to stop rebelling and calls us into relationship with him. And that's where we're going to finish for this morning. That's where we're finished for today. So we're going to, in a way, we're going to press pause on Genesis for just a few weeks. And whenever we return, we're going to be looking at some of the greatest promises that God made to Abram, to Isaac, and to Jacob, the forefathers of the Israelite nation. So that's what's to come. That's what we can look forward to. But just now, let's pray together.